The first evening I walked into the Ashcroft estate as a temporary night nanny, I expected nothing more dramatic than warming bottles, changing diapers, and trying not to embarrass myself in front of people whose living room looked more like the lobby of a luxury hotel than a family home. Instead, I found myself standing in the middle of complete chaos. The newborn heir of the wealthiest family in the city had been crying almost non-stop for 2 days. 3 pediatric specialists had already examined him and agreed on one terrifying possibility: a rare neurological condition that required immediate transfer to a specialized hospital. His exhausted mother sat beside the crib with tears streaming down her face. His father was hurriedly signing medical authorization forms with trembling hands. His grandfather paced across the marble floor, striking his silver-tipped cane with every impatient step. Meanwhile, I stood quietly near the doorway wearing shoes that had cost less than a family dinner, with barely $50 left in my purse, silently wondering how I had managed to lose my job before anyone even learned my name. Then the baby stopped screaming long enough to stare directly into my eyes. A strange voice suddenly echoed inside my head. Rare disease? Seriously? I'm 8 days old, not possessed by ancient spirits. Someone shoved this ridiculous hat over my ear until it feels folded in half. That horrible machine beside me sounds like a tornado trapped inside a seashell, and for heaven's sake, could somebody warm my milk instead of serving it half cold? Every muscle in my body froze. The baby blinked impatiently. Yes, I'm talking to you. The girl with the inexpensive shoes and the only functioning brain in this mansion. Come over here before these overpaid adults send me to intensive care because none of them knows how to dress a baby. No one reacted. The doctors continued discussing scans. His parents continued panicking. No one had heard a single word except me. At that moment I realized only 2 explanations existed. Either I had suddenly lost my mind, or I had somehow gained the impossible ability to hear what babies were truly thinking. If the tiny voice was telling the truth, every expensive expert in the room had overlooked something unbelievably simple. Before I could lose my courage, I stepped forward and quietly cleared my throat. Excuse me, would it be all right if I checked his hat? Every face turned toward me. One of the neurologists looked at me as though I had suggested performing heart surgery with a kitchen spoon. The senior house nanny beside me inhaled sharply, silently begging me not to make the situation worse. Mrs. Ashcroft lifted her tear-filled eyes toward me while Mr. Ashcroft slowly lowered the papers he had been signing. Finally the grandfather fixed me with a hard stare. Who exactly are you? Clara Bennett. Temporary night nanny from the agency. The doctor folded his arms. This infant is experiencing serious neurological symptoms. This is hardly the time for guesses from domestic staff. The baby screamed again, louder than before, while his tiny arms jerked uncontrollably. Inside my mind his frustrated voice shouted, "Don't back down." My ear is folded like yesterday's newspaper. I squeezed the strap of my worn canvas bag until my fingers hurt. Please, just give me 1 minute. If I'm wrong, I'll leave immediately without expecting to be paid. The room fell silent. Finally the old man nodded once. 1 minute. The doctor reluctantly stepped aside with obvious irritation. I approached the crib carefully. The baby was flushed red from crying, damp with sweat, and completely exhausted. The soft designer cap embroidered with his initials looked adorable, but when I lifted one edge I immediately saw the problem. His tiny right ear had been bent sharply underneath the tight seam the entire time. As I gently freed it, relief practically exploded inside my head. Finally. My ear has been liberated. His skin underneath was bright red and irritated. His mother gasped in horror as she realized what had happened. I placed the hat aside before turning my attention toward the white noise machine sitting beside the crib. Instead of soothing ocean waves, it sounded like an angry vacuum cleaner roaring through a tunnel. I lowered the volume until it became a gentle whisper. Much better, the baby sighed inside my thoughts. Now the monster has gone away. May I see his bottle? I asked. A housemaid quickly handed it to me. I touched the milk with my wrist. It wasn't dangerously cold, but certainly not warm enough for an already miserable newborn. Could someone please heat this properly? Warm, not hot. One of the doctors frowned. He has already refused 6 bottles. Without thinking, I answered, he refused 6 cold bottles while someone squeezed his ear flat under a hat. The room became strangely quiet. Apparently I had spoken more honestly than I intended. Ignoring everyone's stares, I loosened the swaddle slightly. Whoever had wrapped him had pulled one side far too tightly, making every startled movement even more uncomfortable. I adjusted the blanket gently before lifting him into my arms. He stiffened for a second, then relaxed with a long satisfied sigh. These hands actually know what they're doing, he murmured inside my mind. Tell my mother to stop crying. I'm not dying. I'm simply surrounded by amateurs. My heart ached as I looked toward Mrs. Ashcroft. She looked completely defeated, as though every cry from her son convinced her she was already failing as a mother. Would you like to feed him? I asked softly. She hesitated. I don't think he wants me. The words hurt far more than they should have. I gently placed her son against her chest, adjusted her arms, and guided the warmed bottle toward his mouth. Almost immediately he began drinking eagerly. Every person in the nursery stopped breathing. His tiny fists slowly relaxed. His eyelids became heavy. Inside my head his satisfied voice declared, acceptable temperature. Promote the nanny. Fire the hat. Mrs. Ashcroft burst into tears again, but this time they were tears of overwhelming relief. Her husband dropped the pen he had been holding, and the hospital transfer papers slid across the polished floor. Even the doctors stood speechless as the child calmly finished half his bottle, released a tiny burp, and drifted peacefully to sleep against his mother's shoulder as though none of the previous 48 hours had ever happened. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. Finally Mr. Ashcroft's father looked directly at me. What was your name again? Clara Bennett. He nodded once. From this moment forward, you are my grandson's personal nanny. My heart nearly stopped. Before I could answer, he continued. Double, no, triple the agency salary. She will have new uniforms, private quarters near the nursery, and anything else she requires. I stared at him in complete disbelief. Inside my head, the sleeping baby mumbled one final sleepy thought before drifting completely into dreams. Excellent. My human is staying. Someone also buy her better shoes. I refused to employ staff that limp. By the following morning, my entire life had changed in ways I could never have imagined. The cheap shoes that had tortured my feet all day had quietly disappeared, replaced by a comfortable new pair waiting outside my bedroom. When I checked my banking app after breakfast, I thought there had been a mistake because the first salary transfer contained more money than I usually earned in several months. But the biggest surprise was waiting upstairs in the nursery. The moment I stepped through the door, little Oliver opened his eyes as though he had been waiting for me. There she is, his cheerful voice echoed inside my mind. Finally. The serious man has been holding me like an important legal document again. Please rescue me. His father stood awkwardly beside the crib with his son cradled stiffly in both arms. He looked far less confident than any billionaire should. I think he doesn't like being with me, he admitted quietly. Oliver frowned with all the dramatic disappointment only a newborn could manage. I don't dislike you. I dislike feeling like unstable luggage. Support my head and hold me closer before I report you to management. I bit the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing. Try bringing him against your chest, I suggested gently. Babies usually feel safer that way. Mr. Ashcroft adjusted his grip exactly as I showed him. Almost immediately Oliver relaxed, blinking thoughtfully. Better. He's a slow learner, but perhaps he'll become an acceptable father after all. Standing near the doorway, Mrs. Harper, the family's longtime head nanny, observed every movement I made. She had spent over 30 years caring for children and clearly didn't appreciate unexplained miracles. Yet when Oliver finished his bottle peacefully for the second time, she simply nodded once and muttered, "Good observation." Coming from her, that sounded almost like applause. The following days became a strange mixture of ordinary childcare and conversations no one else could hear. Oliver had surprisingly strong opinions about almost everything. Bright ceiling lights offended him because they were, according to him, tiny artificial suns attacking innocent babies. Cold changing mats were winter punishment. One expensive knitted blanket had a rough tag that scratched his neck, making him complain that someone had hidden a miniature cactus inside his bedding. Whenever adults leaned directly over his face while making exaggerated smiles and ridiculous baby noises, he became deeply suspicious. "Why do grown-ups believe crossing their eyes makes them more intelligent?" he would ask with genuine confusion. Yet he adored warm bottles, soft humming, his mother's heartbeat, and a floppy stuffed rabbit whose ears were different lengths. "The rabbit understands imperfection," he often declared proudly. As Oliver became calmer, his mother slowly began spending more time in the nursery. At first she hovered nervously near the doorway, constantly asking if she was holding him correctly or feeding him long enough. Every movement seemed filled with fear that she might somehow make another mistake. It didn't take long for me to understand why. On the fourth day, Mr. Ashcroft's elegant older sister, Victoria, arrived to visit. Before she even entered the room, the expensive perfume she wore drifted through the hallway. Oliver immediately stirred in his crib. "Oh no. Perfume lady is back. She smells like flowers trying to hide a knife." His description startled me so badly I nearly dropped the clean blanket I was folding. Victoria smiled sweetly at her sister-in-law. "You look much better today. Rest is obviously helping. It's wonderful that Clara has taken over most of the nursery responsibilities. Some women simply aren't naturally comfortable during the first weeks of motherhood." I saw Evelyn's shoulders tighten immediately. There was nothing openly cruel about the words, yet they landed like tiny needles. Victoria leaned over Oliver's crib. "Hello, precious little angel." Inside my head Oliver groaned dramatically. "She's touching my head again like she's checking fruit at a supermarket." He began fussing almost instantly. Victoria sighed with perfect sympathy. "Poor darling. Babies always sense tension." Evelyn looked devastated. "I wasn't," she whispered. Without allowing myself time to reconsider, I stepped politely between Victoria and the crib. "It's almost his nap time," I said. "He usually settles better without too much stimulation." Victoria's smile never disappeared, but the warmth behind her eyes certainly did. "Of course," she replied smoothly. "You're very attentive." After she left, Oliver released a tiny sigh of relief. "Please write this down somewhere. Perfume lady cannot be trusted." I couldn't explain why his words stayed with me, but they did. Only a few days later my unusual success with Oliver unexpectedly spread beyond the Ashcroft estate. One afternoon another wealthy family arrived carrying a 2-month-old baby boy who refused every bottle anyone offered him. Several pediatricians suspected allergies, digestive disorders, or feeding problems. His exhausted mother looked as though she hadn't slept properly in weeks. The little boy stared directly at me the moment I approached. "I'm starving," he complained dramatically. "This bottle is slower than a snail climbing a mountain. I have to work harder than a construction worker just to drink breakfast." Curious, I examined the bottle nipple and immediately understood. The flow was far too slow for a hungry infant his age. Every feeding required enormous effort, leaving him frustrated before he could finish eating. "Try moving to the next flow size," I suggested. "Let him pause occasionally, but don't make him fight for every drop." One doctor looked skeptical, but the desperate parents agreed immediately. 5 minutes later, their son emptied the bottle peacefully. Finally, he sighed happily inside my thoughts. Modern engineering. His mother burst into tears of relief. That case was followed by another. A little girl screamed every time her father changed her diaper. "She's so dramatic," he complained. The baby glared at him furiously. "Cold wipes. Every single time. Try having ice rubbed across your backside at 2 in the morning and then tell me who's dramatic." I touched one of the wipes. It was freezing. "Warm them in your hands first," I said calmly. "And stop calling her dramatic. She's simply uncomfortable." The father looked embarrassed enough to apologize directly to his daughter. Then came a mother convinced something was wrong because her 4-month-old had never smiled. She arrived carrying expensive educational toys, sensory cards, colorful lights, and enough parenting books to fill a bookstore. "Everyone else's babies smile," she whispered through tears. "Mine doesn't." The little girl watched everyone with complete seriousness. One assistant leaned close while making loud, exaggerated baby sounds. Inside my head came an exhausted complaint. Why does everyone suddenly become a noisy frog whenever they see me? Another assistant shook an expensive musical toy inches from her face. "The shiny weapon has returned," the baby muttered dramatically. I gently asked everyone except the mother to step outside for a few minutes. Then I dimmed the lights and turned off every noisy toy. "Just hold her," I said softly. "Don't perform. Talk to her the way you normally would." At first, the young mother hesitated. Then she sighed and whispered in her natural voice, "I don't know if I'm doing anything right, sweetheart, but I love you." The baby became completely still. "There you are," she whispered happily inside my thoughts. My real mommy came back. A tiny smile slowly appeared across her face. Her mother's sob of relief filled the room. That was the moment I realized I wasn't simply hearing babies. Somehow, I was helping parents hear them too. Within 2 weeks, my phone had somehow become the emergency number passed from one wealthy mother to another. Someone jokingly called me the baby interpreter, while another insisted I had solved problems in 10 minutes that entire teams of specialists had missed. The messages arrived at every hour of the day. My son screams whenever we put him in his crib. My daughter refuses to nap after 4 in the afternoon. Please tell me if my baby hates me or just hates our chandelier. I always smiled at the last one because, strangely enough, either answer felt possible now. Oliver, however, was far less enthusiastic about my growing reputation. Whenever I returned from helping another family, he greeted me with theatrical disappointment. "My employee has become famous," he complained one afternoon. "I suppose I should be proud, but I expect priority service." I laughed quietly while lifting him from his crib. "You're becoming very demanding for someone who still can't hold his own bottle." "Exactly," he answered confidently. "Delegation is an important leadership skill." The requests continued multiplying. One baby screamed every night because the waterproof mattress protector crinkled every time she moved. "It sounds like someone is eating potato chips underneath me," she grumbled. We replaced it with a softer fabric, and she fell asleep before her mother even finished thanking me. Another family spent thousands of dollars on a luxury stroller, yet their little boy cried every time they buckled him in. "These straps are squeezing me like luggage at an airport," he complained. I loosened the harness slightly, making sure it remained perfectly safe, and he immediately settled. His father stared at the stroller as though it had personally betrayed him. Another infant refused every afternoon nap because the mobile hanging above his crib had one giraffe tilted at an awkward angle. "That crooked giraffe has been staring at me for 3 days, the baby whispered suspiciously. "I don't trust him." I turned the giraffe so it faced the correct direction. The baby studied it carefully. "Acceptable. He may remain." Less than 2 minutes later, he was asleep. His mother looked at me in complete disbelief. "We hired a sleep consultant for $6,000, she murmured. I glanced at the innocent-looking giraffe and couldn't help smiling. Perhaps the consultant had simply underestimated the importance of trustworthy giraffes. Every case reminded me that babies weren't mysterious. They were simply honest. Adults searched for complicated explanations while children usually protested something surprisingly simple. One evening I visited a family convinced their son suffered terrible evening colic because he cried every night at exactly 8 o'clock. His grandmother insisted it was digestive pain. His father blamed growing pains. His exhausted mother believed something serious had been overlooked. The little boy, meanwhile, glared toward the nursery wall with deep frustration. "Every night the explosions begin," he complained. "Father's television starts another war and nobody seems to notice except me." I looked toward the adjoining room. "What's on the other side of this wall?" I asked. The father shrugged. "Our living room." His wife looked at him knowingly. "Your action movies." He frowned. "They're not that loud." Right on cue, a deafening explosion echoed through the wall from the expensive surround sound system. The baby startled violently. "See," he cried. "The war has started again." The father slowly removed his glasses, stared toward the television, then quietly switched to headphones that very evening. Their son slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Later that night his wife sent me a video of her husband sitting silently in front of the television wearing enormous headphones while their baby slept happily next door. The caption simply read, "You saved both our son and our marriage." As word spread, the invitations became stranger. One woman offered me an expensive diamond bracelet if I could help her twins sleep through the night. Another family sent a fruit basket so enormous I thought someone had delivered furniture by mistake. Mrs. Harper inspected it carefully before nodding with unexpected approval. At least they chose good pairs. Coming from her, that qualified as overwhelming enthusiasm. Despite all the attention, life inside the Ashcroft mansion remained my greatest priority. Oliver was growing stronger every week, and watching Evelyn slowly gain confidence as a mother became one of the happiest parts of my day. She no longer stood nervously near the nursery door. She held her son naturally now, spoke to him without fear, and smiled more often than she cried. But not everyone welcomed that change. Victoria visited more frequently than before. She always arrived smiling, always spoke politely, and somehow always left behind a trail of uncertainty. She never openly criticized Evelyn. Instead, she planted tiny doubts. "Perhaps you're still too tired today. Maybe Clara should handle the feeding." New mothers often don't notice little details. Each sentence sounded kind. Together they became poison. Oliver noticed it too. "Perfume lady smiles with her mouth," he whispered one afternoon. But not with the rest of her. I began observing more carefully. Soon I noticed strange things happening only after Victoria's visits. Bottles were placed in different positions. Feeding notes mysteriously disappeared before the next shift arrived. The nursery sound machine somehow returned to its painfully loud setting despite no one admitting to touching it. One morning Oliver refused his bottle after only a single sip. "Something's different," he muttered. "Not dangerous, just wrong." Perfume lady touched it. I couldn't explain how he knew, yet neither could I ignore the pattern. Then another incident confirmed my suspicions. Evelyn carefully wrote detailed instructions for the nursery staff before leaving briefly to rest. Later those notes vanished. At breakfast Victoria casually remarked, "Poor Evelyn seems so forgetful these days." Evelyn immediately apologized, convinced she had misplaced them herself. I found the papers hidden inside a completely different drawer. Oliver had been right again. "Mother didn't lose them," he insisted. "Someone moved them." My concern deepened with every passing day. Victoria never did enough to attract suspicion. She simply nudged events in directions that made Evelyn question herself. If a bottle appeared late, it looked like exhaustion. If feeding instructions changed, it seemed like forgetfulness. If Oliver became unsettled after a visit, everyone assumed babies simply had difficult days. Except I knew better. Mrs. Harper eventually approached me while folding Oliver's tiny clothes. "You've noticed it too," she said quietly without looking up. I nodded. "I don't know exactly what she's doing." Mrs. Harper sighed heavily. "Neither do I. But she's creating confusion." We watched Evelyn through the nursery window as she rocked Oliver gently to sleep. She looked happier than she had during my first night in the mansion, yet tiny shadows of self-doubt still crossed her face whenever Victoria entered the room. "This house has survived many storms," Mrs. Harper murmured. "Sometimes the quiet ones cause the most damage." I realized then that listening to babies had become only part of my responsibility. If I truly wanted to protect Oliver, I also had to protect the mother he loved most. And somehow I had the uneasy feeling that the most difficult battle was only beginning. The turning point came after a late-night call from another wealthy household across town. They insisted their 6-month-old nephew refused to sleep, cried constantly whenever the nannies held him, and barely finished his bottles. They blamed a difficult personality. The moment I entered the nursery, something felt wrong. The room was beautiful, perfectly decorated, filled with expensive furniture, but it felt strangely empty, almost cold. The little boy lay quietly in his crib without the energy to cry loudly anymore. His tiny voice reached me the instant our eyes met. "Please let this one be the food lady." My heart tightened. This wasn't another noisy sound machine or uncomfortable blanket. I checked the feeding records. Everything looked perfectly organized, almost suspiciously perfect. Yet the bottles prepared for him didn't match the schedule that had been carefully written down. His diaper had clearly been left unchanged for far too long. The woman supervising his care smiled politely. "He's simply very demanding." I lifted him into my arms, and before I even offered a bottle, he desperately searched against my shoulder. "Hungry," he whispered weakly. "Always hungry." I looked directly at the woman. "He's not difficult." My voice remained calm. "He's starving." Her smile vanished instantly. "We follow the doctor's schedule." "No," I answered quietly. "You follow paperwork." "He needs someone to follow him." Through Mr. Ashcroft's connections, we contacted the baby's father, who was away on business. He arrived within hours. When I placed his son into his arms after finally feeding him properly, the baby sighed with complete relief. "I remember this heartbeat," he murmured. "Home." His father broke down in tears. I left before the arguments inside that house truly began. When I returned to the Ashcroft estate late that evening, Oliver greeted me with exaggerated outrage. "You abandoned me for another tiny citizen," he declared. "Also, my diaper is uncomfortable. Please resolve both emergencies immediately." I laughed so suddenly that Mrs. Harper glanced at me from across the nursery. "Long day?" she asked. "Very long," I admitted. But despite the humor, something inside the mansion continued to feel increasingly wrong. Oliver became unsettled after nearly every one of Victoria's visits. Bottles that had been carefully prepared somehow tasted different. "She touched this one," Oliver complained one morning after refusing his milk. "Not spoiled. Just wrong." The nursery sound machine mysteriously returned to its painfully loud setting more than once. Evelyn's handwritten care instructions repeatedly disappeared, only to reappear in strange places later. Victoria continued smiling sweetly while quietly suggesting that Evelyn seemed overwhelmed or forgetful. The changes were tiny when viewed individually. Together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Finally, I told Evelyn everything I had observed. She stared silently into her tea for several moments before whispering, "I thought I was imagining it." Together we spoke with her husband that same evening. At first, Daniel struggled to believe us. Victoria had always been part of the family. The accusations sounded impossible. But Mrs. Harper calmly confirmed that she had noticed the same irregularities. Slowly, doubt appeared across his face. Mr. Ashcroft's father listened quietly before striking his cane against the floor only once. Then we find the truth. The following afternoon we prepared a simple trap. We discreetly marked bottles, feeding notes, and nursery equipment so any changes could be traced. Hidden security cameras already monitored the hallway outside the nursery. Then we waited. Victoria arrived exactly as expected. She believed I was visiting another family that afternoon. From the adjoining sitting room we watched silently through the slightly open door. Oliver awoke almost immediately. "Perfume lady," he sighed dramatically. "This should be interesting." Victoria approached the crib, smiling warmly. Once she believed herself alone, she quietly exchanged one prepared bottle for another, increased the sound machine's volume, removed Evelyn's feeding instructions from the table, and calmly told a junior nanny, "If anyone asks, Mrs. Ashcroft requested these changes herself." Evelyn covered her mouth in shock. Daniel's expression hardened into something I had never seen before. Mr. Ashcroft's father opened the nursery door without saying a word. Victoria turned around gracefully, still smiling. "Oh. I didn't realize anyone was here." Evelyn walked directly to the crib, lifted Oliver into her arms, and for the first time spoke without hesitation. "You weren't helping my son," she said quietly. "You were trying to convince everyone I couldn't care for him." Victoria attempted one final smile. "You're exhausted, Evelyn. You're misunderstanding everything." "No," Evelyn answered. "For the first time, I understand perfectly." Oliver relaxed against her shoulder. "Mother sounds different today," he whispered proudly. "She sounds brave." Daniel placed the marked bottle on the table while Mrs. Harper produced the original feeding notes. Then the hallway security footage confirmed everything we had witnessed. One incident could have been explained away. A dozen identical incidents could not. Victoria's smile finally disappeared. She looked directly at me. "This is what happens when servants forget their place." Before I could answer, Mr. Ashcroft's father spoke first. "Her place has been beside my great-grandson since the day she walked into this house." His voice remained calm, yet every word carried enormous weight. "Yours, however, is no longer here." Security escorted Victoria from the estate before sunset. She never looked back. Oliver watched from Evelyn's arms with deep satisfaction. Perfume Lady has finally lost the election. I nearly laughed despite the seriousness of the moment. The weeks that followed changed everything. Daniel apologized openly to Evelyn for doubting her instincts. Instead of relying only on experts, he began trusting his wife. He learned how to hold Oliver confidently, fed him without fear, and spent evenings quietly sitting beside his family instead of hiding behind endless paperwork. Evelyn transformed as well. The frightened woman I had met on my first night slowly disappeared. In her place stood a mother who no longer questioned whether her son loved her. She finally understood what I had known from the beginning. He had never rejected her. He had simply needed someone willing to listen. A month later, Mr. Ashcroft's father invited me into his study. Instead of discussing nursery schedules, he handed me a proposal. The Ashcroft Foundation wanted to create a parenting support program that trained nannies, educated families, and helped parents understand children's real needs before small problems became painful ones. They wanted me to lead it. I stared at the papers in disbelief. "I'm only a nanny," I whispered. The old man smiled for the first time since I had met him. "No. You're someone who reminded an entire family that even the smallest voice deserves to be heard." That evening I looked around the nursery where everything had begun. My old life had started with $50 in my purse, aching feet, and the certainty that I would be dismissed before sunrise. Instead, I had found a family, a purpose, and a gift I still couldn't explain. Oliver opened one sleepy eye as I tucked him into bed. "Don't worry," he mumbled. You'll still be my favorite human, even if you become important. I gently kissed his forehead. Thank you for trusting me. His final thought drifted softly through my mind before sleep carried him away. Thank you for listening. And in that quiet moment I realized the greatest miracle had never been hearing babies speak. The real miracle was discovering that every child had always been speaking. Most adults had simply forgotten how to listen.